Question 1. Compliance review shows that an applicant for a firearm license renewal in Israel has recently experienced a significant change in their employment status. What is the most appropriate course of action for the applicant and their representative to ensure successful renewal under the Israeli firearms law? Option A. Contact a licensing officer informally for an opinion on the employment change before submitting any formal application or documentation. Option B. Gather all updated required documentation, including a current medical certificate and any necessary psychological evaluations, and submit a comprehensive application that clearly explains the employment change with supporting evidence. Option C. Submit the renewal application with only the expired documentation and a brief, unsubstantiated statement about the employment change. Option D. Assume the change in employment status automatically disqualifies the applicant and withdraw the renewal application. Correct answer is B. Gather all updated required documentation, including a current medical certificate and any necessary psychological evaluations, and submit a comprehensive application that clearly explains the employment change with supporting evidence. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires navigating the specific requirements for firearm licensing in Israel, particularly concerning the renewal process and the documentation needed to demonstrate continued eligibility. Misinterpreting or failing to adhere to these regulations can lead to the denial of a license, potential legal repercussions, and a failure to uphold public safety standards. The applicant's personal circumstances, such as a recent change in employment status, directly impact their eligibility and necessitate a thorough understanding of the Israeli firearms law and its associated regulations. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves meticulously gathering all required documentation as stipulated by the Israeli firearms law and the Ministry of National Security's guidelines for license renewal. This includes obtaining an updated medical certificate from a recognized physician confirming the applicant's fitness to possess a firearm, a psychological evaluation if deemed necessary by the licensing authority, and proof of continued residency and lawful status in Israel. Crucially, the applicant must also provide a clear explanation and any supporting documentation regarding their change in employment status, demonstrating that this change does not negatively affect their eligibility criteria as defined by law. This approach ensures full compliance with the regulatory framework, prioritizes accuracy and completeness of information, and proactively addresses potential concerns of the licensing authority. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to submit the renewal application with only the expired documentation and a brief, unsubstantiated statement about the employment change. This fails to meet the explicit requirements for updated medical and potentially psychological assessments, and it does not provide the licensing authority with sufficient information to assess the impact of the employment change on the applicant's eligibility. This approach risks immediate rejection due to incomplete or outdated documentation, violating the spirit and letter of the law. Another incorrect approach is to assume that a change in employment status automatically disqualifies the applicant without seeking clarification or providing evidence to the contrary. This demonstrates a lack of understanding of the nuances of the Israeli firearms law, which may allow for continued licensing under certain employment changes if other eligibility criteria are met. This approach is overly cautious to the point of being obstructive and fails to advocate for the applicant's rights within the legal framework. A further incorrect approach is to attempt to bypass the standard renewal procedures by directly contacting a licensing officer for an informal opinion without submitting the formal application and required documentation. While communication is important, the official process is designed to ensure a standardized and documented review of all applications. Relying on informal channels can lead to misinterpretations, lack of a formal record, and ultimately, a failure to secure the license through the proper legal channels. Professional reasoning. Professionals dealing with firearm license applications in Israel should adopt a systematic and compliant approach. This involves 1. Thoroughly understanding the current Israeli firearms law and relevant regulations, including specific requirements for renewal and documentation. 2. Clearly communicating these requirements to the applicant and guiding them in gathering all necessary documents, including updated medical and psychological evaluations and evidence of lawful status. 3. assisting the applicant in preparing a comprehensive explanation and supporting evidence for any changes in their personal circumstances, such as employment. 4. Submitting a complete and accurate application package to the licensing authority, ensuring all regulatory obligations are met. 5. Maintaining open communication with the licensing authority if further clarification or documentation is requested. This structured process ensures adherence to legal mandates, promotes fairness, and upholds public safety. Question 2. Compliance review shows an applicant for a firearm license in Israel has a history of seeking treatment for anxiety and depression several years ago, which they believe is fully resolved. What is the most appropriate course of action for this applicant to ensure compliance with Israeli firearm licensing regulations? Option A. Disclose only the most recent mental health treatment, assuming past resolved issues are not relevant to current firearm possession. Option B. Fully disclose all past mental health treatment, including the history of anxiety and depression, to the Israel Police Licensing Authority, and be prepared to provide any required medical documentation or opinions. Option C. Assume that since the mental health issues are resolved, they do not need to be disclosed as they are no longer a factor in their fitness. Option D. Rely on informal advice from acquaintances who have obtained firearm licenses in Israel, regarding which past medical conditions are typically overlooked by the authorities. The correct answer is B. Fully disclose all past mental health treatment, including the history of anxiety and depression, to the Israel Police Licensing Authority, and be prepared to provide any required medical documentation or opinions. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an applicant to navigate the specific requirements for firearm licensing in Israel, which are governed by strict regulations designed to ensure public safety. Misinterpreting or failing to adhere to these regulations can lead to the denial of a license, potential legal repercussions, and a failure to meet the core objective of responsible firearm ownership. The applicant's personal circumstances, particularly their history of mental health treatment, necessitate careful consideration of the Israeli Ministry of Health's guidelines and the Israel Police's licensing criteria. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves the applicant proactively and truthfully disclosing their complete medical history, including all past mental health treatments, to the licensing authority in Israel. This approach is correct because Israeli firearm licensing law, specifically the Firearms Law of 1949 and associated regulations, places a strong emphasis on the applicant's mental and physical fitness to possess a firearm. Full disclosure ensures that the licensing authority can conduct a thorough assessment based on accurate information, potentially requiring a medical opinion from a designated physician or psychiatrist. This aligns with the ethical obligation of honesty and the legal requirement to provide all relevant information for a licensing decision. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to only disclose recent mental health treatment while omitting past episodes. This is professionally unacceptable because it constitutes a failure to provide complete and accurate information, which is a direct violation of the licensing requirements. The licensing authority is entitled to a comprehensive understanding of an applicant's history to make an informed decision regarding public safety. Omitting past treatment can be interpreted as an attempt to conceal information that might be relevant to fitness, leading to license denial or revocation if discovered. Another incorrect approach is to assume that a past mental health issue, once resolved, is irrelevant and therefore does not need to be disclosed. This is professionally unsound as it bypasses the established regulatory process. The licensing authority, not the applicant, determines the relevance of past medical history. The decision-making framework for firearm licensing in Israel explicitly requires disclosure of all conditions that could potentially affect an individual's ability to safely handle a firearm, regardless of perceived resolution. A further incorrect approach is to rely on anecdotal advice from friends or online forums regarding disclosure requirements without consulting the official guidelines or seeking professional legal counsel. This is professionally risky because such advice may be outdated, inaccurate, or not specific to the nuances of Israeli law and policy. The official channels for information and application are the only reliable sources for ensuring compliance. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing similar situations should adopt a systematic approach. First, thoroughly research and understand the specific legal and regulatory framework governing the license application in the relevant jurisdiction, in this case, Israel. Second, prioritize absolute honesty and completeness in all disclosures, especially concerning sensitive personal information like medical history. Third, if there is any ambiguity or concern about disclosure requirements, seek clarification directly from the licensing authority or consult with a legal professional specializing in Israeli firearm law. Finally, always act in accordance with the spirit and letter of the law, recognizing that firearm licensing is a privilege granted based on demonstrated fitness and responsibility. Question 3. Market research indicates a growing interest among Israeli citizens in acquiring firearms for personal protection, leading some to explore less conventional methods of obtaining them. A licensed firearm owner in Tel Aviv is considering allowing a close family member, who does not possess a license, to temporarily store and use their firearm for self-defense purposes. What is the most appropriate and legally compliant course of action for the licensed owner to ensure adherence to Israeli firearms regulations? Option A. The licensed owner can transfer the firearm to the family member's name for storage, with the understanding that it will be returned once the immediate need for self-defense has passed. Option B. The licensed owner can permit the family member to store and use the firearm temporarily, provided they have a verbal agreement and the family member is aware of basic firearm safety. Option C. The licensed owner must ensure the family member undergoes the full firearm licensing process through the Ministry of National Security, including all required background checks and evaluations, before any possession or use of the firearm is permitted. Option D. The licensed owner can arrange for the firearm to be held by a third-party security company in Jerusalem until the family member obtains their own license. The correct answer is C. The licensed owner must ensure the family member undergoes the full firearm licensing process through the Ministry of National Security, including all required background checks and evaluations, before any possession or use of the firearm is permitted. Explanation. Market research demonstrates that individuals seeking firearm licenses in Israel are increasingly exploring alternative pathways to ownership beyond traditional application routes. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a nuanced understanding of the Israeli firearms law 5707-1947. Hebrew Het, Hebrew Vav, Hebrew Kuf, Hebrew Kaf, Hebrew Lamed, Hebrew Yod, Hebrew Yod, Hebrew Resh, Hebrew Yod, Hebrew Yod, Hebrew He, Hebrew He, Hebrew Tav, Hebrew Shin, Hebrew Zayin 1947, and its associated regulations, particularly concerning the definition of possession and the proper channels for acquiring firearms. Misinterpreting these regulations can lead to severe legal consequences, including criminal charges and the permanent revocation of any firearm license. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding of the legal framework governing firearm acquisition and possession in Israel. This means recognizing that the firearms law strictly defines who is eligible to possess a firearm and under what conditions. It mandates a formal application process, including background checks, psychological evaluations, and demonstrated need, all overseen by the Ministry of National Security. Therefore, the attempt to circumvent these established procedures, even through seemingly indirect means, is fundamentally flawed. The law is designed to ensure public safety and responsible firearm ownership, and adherence to its explicit requirements is paramount. An incorrect approach would be to assume that acquiring a firearm through a private arrangement with a licensed individual, without following the official Ministry of National Security application and transfer process, constitutes legal possession. This fails to acknowledge that the firearms law requires all firearm transfers to be officially registered and approved. Another incorrect approach would be to believe that a firearm can be borrowed indefinitely from a licensed relative without undergoing the proper licensing procedures for the borrower. This misunderstands the concept of possession and control under Israeli law, which attributes responsibility to the individual in actual control of the firearm. Finally, attempting to obtain a firearm through a foreign entity or individual without adhering to Israeli import and licensing regulations would also be a grave error, as it bypasses the stringent domestic controls established by the firearms law. Professionals in this field must adopt a decision-making process rooted in strict adherence to the Israeli firearms law. This involves 1. Identifying the specific legal requirements for firearm ownership and possession in Israel. 2. Consulting official guidelines and regulations issued by the Ministry of National Security. 3. Prioritizing formal legal channels for all firearm-related transactions. 4. Recognizing that any deviation from the prescribed legal process, regardless of intent, carries significant legal risks. Question 4. The performance metrics show a significant increase in the average time taken to process firearm license renewal applications in Tel Aviv. Considering the Israeli Firearms Law 5707-1947 and its regulations, which of the following actions best addresses this issue while maintaining regulatory compliance and public safety? Option A. Reduce the frequency and depth of background checks for renewal applications to expedite processing. Option B. Conduct a detailed analysis of each stage of the renewal process to identify specific bottlenecks and implement targeted procedural improvements and resource allocation adjustments. Option C. Advise applicants that renewal processing times will be extended indefinitely due to increased workload. Option D. Immediately assign additional overtime hours to existing licensing officers to clear the backlog of renewal applications. The correct answer is B. Conduct a detailed analysis of each stage of the renewal process to identify specific bottlenecks and implement targeted procedural improvements and resource allocation adjustments. Explanation. The performance metrics show a concerning trend in the processing times for firearm license renewals in Israel. This scenario is professionally challenging because it directly impacts public safety and the efficient administration of the firearm licensing system, governed by the Israeli Firearms Law 5707-1947 and its associated regulations. Delays can lead to individuals possessing firearms with expired licenses, creating a potential security risk, or conversely, causing undue hardship for law-abiding citizens who rely on their firearms for legitimate purposes. Careful judgment is required to balance the need for thoroughness in the licensing process with the imperative of timely service. The best professional approach involves a proactive and systematic review of the renewal process to identify bottlenecks and implement targeted improvements. This includes analyzing the specific stages of renewal, such as application submission, background checks, and final approval, to pinpoint where delays are occurring. Based on this analysis, the responsible authority should develop and implement procedural enhancements, potentially including increased staffing during peak periods, streamlining documentation requirements where legally permissible, or leveraging technology for more efficient data processing. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the root causes of the performance issues within the existing legal framework, prioritizing both public safety and administrative efficiency as mandated by the spirit and letter of Israeli firearms legislation. It demonstrates a commitment to continuous improvement and adherence to the principles of good governance. An incorrect approach would be to simply increase the workload on existing staff without identifying the specific causes of the delays. This might lead to burnout and further inefficiencies, failing to address the underlying systemic issues. It also risks compromising the thoroughness of background checks, which is a critical regulatory requirement for maintaining public safety. Another incorrect approach would be to relax the background check procedures to speed up renewals. This is ethically and regulatorily unacceptable, as it directly contravenes the stringent safety requirements of the firearms law and could significantly increase the risk of firearms falling into the wrong hands. A further incorrect approach would be to ignore the performance metrics altogether, assuming the delays are temporary or unavoidable. This demonstrates a lack of accountability and a failure to uphold the duty of care owed to the public and license holders. It also neglects the legal obligation to administer the licensing system effectively. Professionals should employ a data-driven decision-making process. This involves 1. Identifying the problem performance metrics showing delays. 2. Gathering relevant data to understand the scope and nature of the problem. 3. Analyzing the data to identify root causes within the regulatory framework. 4. Developing and evaluating potential solutions based on their feasibility, effectiveness, and compliance with Israeli law. 5. Implementing the chosen solution. And 6. Monitoring the results to ensure continuous improvement. Question 5. Stakeholder feedback indicates a need to clarify the decision-making process for firearm license applications in Israel, particularly when applicants present personal circumstances that evoke sympathy but may not directly align with objective licensing criteria. An applicant for a firearm license, Rishayon Yeryia, in Tel Aviv has submitted their application, citing a general feeling of unease in their neighborhood and a desire for personal protection. They have also mentioned a minor, non-violent conviction from over 10 years ago for a minor traffic violation. The licensing officer is aware of the applicant's personal situation and the general security concerns in the region, which approach best ensures compliance with Israeli firearm licensing regulations while upholding professional integrity. Option A. Deny the license immediately due to the past minor conviction, without further investigation into its relevance to firearm ownership eligibility. Option B. Grant the license based on the applicant's expressed fear and the general security concerns, assuming that a desire for self-protection is sufficient grounds for a license. Option C. Conduct a thorough review of the applicant's documentation, cross-referencing their stated reasons for seeking a license and their past conviction against the specific eligibility requirements and disqualifying factors, as defined by the Ministry of National Security's firearm licensing regulations. Option D. Delegate the decision-making authority to a senior officer who has a personal acquaintance with the applicant, without a formal review of the application's merits. The correct answer is C. Conduct a thorough review of the applicant's documentation, cross-referencing their stated reasons for seeking a license and their past conviction against the specific eligibility requirements and disqualifying factors, as defined by the Ministry of National Security's firearm licensing regulations. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing an individual's right to self-defense with the stringent public safety requirements mandated by Israeli firearm licensing laws. The applicant's personal circumstances, while potentially sympathetic, must be evaluated against objective criteria established by the Ministry of National Security. Misinterpreting or misapplying these criteria can lead to either an unwarranted denial of a license, infringing on rights, or an unjustified approval, potentially compromising public safety. Careful judgment is required to ensure adherence to the law while considering all relevant factors. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough and objective review of the applicant's submitted documentation, cross-referencing it with the specific eligibility criteria outlined in Israeli firearm licensing regulations. This approach prioritizes adherence to the established legal framework, ensuring that decisions are based on demonstrable facts and legal requirements rather than subjective interpretations or external pressures. The regulatory justification lies in the principle of due process and the clear mandate given to licensing authorities to assess applicants against defined standards for public safety. This method ensures consistency and fairness in the licensing process. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach involves granting the license based solely on the applicant's stated fear of reprisal, without independently verifying the grounds for this fear, or assessing its objective severity against the legal thresholds for self-defense firearm permits. This fails to comply with the requirement for demonstrable threats and objective risk assessment, potentially overlooking the need for a formal security assessment or evidence of immediate danger as stipulated by regulations. Another incorrect approach is to deny the license immediately upon learning of the applicant's past minor infractions, without a comprehensive review of how these infractions relate to the criteria for firearm ownership. Israeli law often allows for consideration of the nature and recency of offenses, and a blanket denial without such nuanced evaluation would be a regulatory failure. The focus must be on whether the past behavior demonstrates a propensity for violence or irresponsibility that would disqualify them under the law. A further incorrect approach is to defer the decision to a colleague without proper delegation or established procedure, especially if the colleague lacks the specific authority or expertise to make such a determination. This bypasses the established decision-making hierarchy and regulatory process, potentially leading to an inconsistent or improperly authorized decision. It undermines the accountability framework for licensing decisions. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this role should employ a structured decision-making process. First, they must thoroughly understand the relevant sections of the Israeli firearms law and the accompanying regulations concerning licensing criteria, including those related to personal safety, criminal history, and mental fitness. Second, they must meticulously review all submitted documentation, seeking corroborating evidence where necessary. Third, they should apply the legal criteria objectively to the facts presented, avoiding personal bias or emotional responses. Finally, they must document their decision-making process clearly, justifying their conclusion based on the applicable laws and regulations. Question 6. Regulatory review indicates that an applicant in Israel has submitted a renewal application for their firearm license, Rishayon Yeryia, providing a medical certificate that is now expired by 2 months. The applicant asserts they are in excellent health and requests an expedited renewal, stating they will obtain a new certificate from their physician within the next week. What is the most appropriate course of action for the licensing authority to ensure compliance with Israeli firearm licensing regulations? Option A. Grant a provisional renewal for a limited period, contingent on the applicant submitting the updated medical certificate within 7 days. Option B. Request an updated medical certificate from a recognized Israeli physician that meets current validity requirements before processing the renewal. Option C. Accept the applicant's self-declaration of good health and proceed with the renewal, deferring the medical certificate requirement until the next renewal cycle. Option D. Issue the renewal based on the applicant's long history of responsible firearm ownership, considering the expired medical certificate as a minor oversight. The correct answer is B. Request an updated medical certificate from a recognized Israeli physician that meets current validity requirements before processing the renewal. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge involving the interpretation and application of Israeli firearm licensing regulations, specifically concerning the renewal process and the requirement for updated documentation. The challenge lies in balancing the applicant's desire for a swift renewal with the strict legal obligations of the licensing authority to ensure all conditions are met. Misinterpreting or overlooking these requirements can lead to regulatory noncompliance, potential legal repercussions for the authority, and an improperly licensed firearm in circulation. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves meticulously verifying that all required documentation, including the updated medical certificate from a recognized Israeli physician, is current and compliant with the specific requirements stipulated by the Israeli firearms law and its associated regulations for license renewal. This approach is correct because it directly adheres to the legal mandate of the licensing authority to ensure that all applicants for firearm license renewal meet the ongoing eligibility criteria, which explicitly includes demonstrating continued physical and mental fitness as certified by a qualified medical professional in Israel. This ensures public safety and upholds the integrity of the licensing system. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves accepting the applicant's self-declaration of good health and the expired medical certificate without further inquiry or requiring updated documentation. This fails to meet the regulatory obligation to confirm ongoing fitness for firearm possession, as mandated by Israeli law. The expired certificate does not provide current assurance of the applicant's suitability, creating a significant regulatory gap and potential public safety risk. Another incorrect approach is to grant an immediate provisional renewal based solely on the applicant's assurance that they will obtain the updated medical certificate within a short period, without first receiving the document. This bypasses a critical prerequisite for renewal, effectively issuing a license without the necessary legal foundation. It undermines the authority's duty to enforce the law strictly and could lead to the issuance of a license to an individual who may no longer be medically fit to possess a firearm. A further incorrect approach is to dismiss the requirement for an updated medical certificate altogether, citing the applicant's long history of responsible firearm ownership. While past behavior is relevant, it does not negate the legal requirement for current medical fitness. Israeli firearm licensing regulations are designed to ensure ongoing suitability, and relying solely on past compliance without current verification is a direct contravention of these regulations. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this role must adopt a systematic and compliance-driven decision-making process. This involves 1. Clearly understanding the specific legal requirements for firearm license renewal in Israel, including all necessary documentation and their validity periods. 2. Prioritizing regulatory compliance above expediency or applicant convenience. 3. Verifying all submitted documentation against the legal standards. 4. communicating clearly with applicants about the requirements and the reasons for them. 5. Escalating any ambiguities or complex cases to legal counsel or senior management if necessary. The core principle is to uphold the law and ensure public safety through rigorous adherence to established procedures. Question 7. Performance analysis shows that an applicant for a firearm license, Yeryia, in Israel has a past conviction for a minor offense that occurred over 10 years ago, for which they received a suspended sentence and have had no further legal issues since. What is the most appropriate approach for the applicant to take when submitting their application to the Israeli Firearms Licensing Department? Option A. Disclose the conviction and emphasize that it was a minor offense without offering further context or evidence of rehabilitation. Option B. Disclose the conviction but provide only a brief, vague statement about its nature. Option C. Fully disclose the past conviction, provide a detailed explanation of the circumstances surrounding it, and submit evidence of rehabilitation and a clean record since the offense. Option D. Omit any mention of the past conviction, assuming it is too old to be relevant. The correct answer is C. Fully disclose the past conviction, provide a detailed explanation of the circumstances surrounding it, and submit evidence of rehabilitation and a clean record since the offense. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an applicant to navigate the Israeli firearm licensing process while dealing with a potentially disqualifying past event. The challenge lies in accurately and truthfully disclosing all relevant information to the licensing authority, understanding what constitutes a disqualifying offense under Israeli law, and presenting mitigating circumstances effectively. Failure to do so can lead to immediate denial and potential future restrictions. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves a proactive and transparent disclosure of the past conviction, accompanied by a comprehensive explanation of the circumstances and evidence of rehabilitation. This aligns with the principles of honesty and full disclosure mandated by the Israeli firearms law. Hebrew Het, Hebrew Vav, Hebrew Kuf, Hebrew Kaf, Hebrew Lamed, Hebrew Yod, Hebrew Yod, Hebrew Resh, Hebrew Yod, Hebrew Yod, Hebrew He, Hebrew He, Hebrew Tav, Hebrew Shin, Hebrew Yod 1949, and its associated regulations. Specifically, the law requires applicants to provide all information relevant to their suitability, and the licensing authority has the discretion to grant a license if the applicant can demonstrate that the past offense does not pose a risk to public safety. Presenting evidence of rehabilitation, such as a clean record since the offense, stable employment, and community involvement, directly addresses the authority's concerns about public safety and demonstrates the applicant's current suitability. This approach respects the regulatory framework by being upfront and allowing the authority to make an informed decision based on the totality of the circumstances. Incorrect approach is analysis. Failing to disclose the conviction entirely is a direct violation of the Israeli firearms law's disclosure requirements. This constitutes a material misrepresentation, which is grounds for immediate denial and can lead to severe penalties, including criminal charges and a permanent ban on firearm ownership. Licensing authority relies on complete and accurate information to assess risk, and concealment undermines this process entirely. Disclosing the conviction, but without any context or explanation, while technically fulfilling the disclosure requirement, is insufficient. It leaves the licensing authority to make assumptions based solely on the conviction itself, without the benefit of understanding the mitigating factors or the applicant's subsequent positive trajectory. This approach fails to proactively address potential concerns and misses the opportunity to demonstrate rehabilitation, making denial more likely. Attempting to downplay the severity of the conviction without providing supporting evidence or a clear explanation of the circumstances is also problematic. While context is important, simply minimizing the offense without substantiation can be perceived as evasive or dishonest. The licensing authority needs to understand the nature of the offense and its relevance to firearm suitability, not just a subjective assessment of its severity by the applicant. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such situations should adopt a strategy of full transparency and proactive engagement with the regulatory requirements. This involves understanding the specific disclosure obligations under the relevant legislation, in this case, the Israeli firearms law, identifying any potential disqualifying factors, and preparing to present a comprehensive case that addresses these factors. The decision-making process should prioritize honesty, thoroughness, and the ability to demonstrate current suitability, and a commitment to public safety, rather than attempting to circumvent or obscure relevant information. Question 8. The efficiency study reveals that the current process for obtaining a Rishayon Yeryia in Israel is experiencing significant delays. To address this, a proposal is made to implement a new, faster application review system that reduces the number of mandatory interviews for first-time applicants, provided they have no prior criminal record. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the regulatory framework governing firearm licensing in Israel? Option A. Focus solely on reducing the time spent on each interview and background check, without altering the scope or depth of the required investigations. Option B. Introduce a completely new proprietary software system for license application processing that bypasses some of the existing verification steps to speed up approvals. Option C. Immediately implement a revised application process that reduces mandatory interviews for applicants with no criminal record, thereby expediting the issuance of licenses. Option D. Conduct a comprehensive review of the Firearms Law, 5707-1947, and its regulations to identify procedural bottlenecks and propose amendments or operational adjustments that enhance efficiency, while strictly adhering to all legal requirements for applicant vetting and public safety. Correct answer is D. Conduct a comprehensive review of the Firearms Law, 5707-1947, and its regulations to identify procedural bottlenecks and propose amendments or operational adjustments that enhance efficiency, while strictly adhering to all legal requirements for applicant vetting and public safety. Explanation. The efficiency study reveals a need to streamline the firearm licensing process in Israel. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the imperative of public safety, which is paramount in firearm regulation, with the need for efficient administrative processes. Misjudgments can lead to either undue delays for legitimate applicants or, more critically, potential security risks. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the existing Firearms Law, 5707-1947, and its associated regulations, specifically focusing on the criteria and procedures for issuing a Rishayon Yeryia firearm license. This approach prioritizes adherence to the legal framework by identifying any ambiguities or inefficiencies within the current regulations that might be hindering the process. It then proposes amendments or procedural adjustments that are strictly within the bounds of the law and aim to enhance efficiency without compromising the rigorous vetting process required for firearm ownership. This ensures that any changes are legally sound, maintain public safety standards, and are justifiable under the existing legislative intent. An incorrect approach would be to bypass or significantly alter the mandatory background checks and security assessments stipulated by the Firearms Law. This could involve expediting licenses without completing all required investigations or reducing the scrutiny applied to applicant history. Such actions directly violate the spirit and letter of the law, which mandates comprehensive checks to prevent firearms from falling into unauthorized hands. Another incorrect approach would be to implement a new, unapproved licensing system that deviates from the established procedures outlined in the Firearms Law, potentially creating loopholes or inconsistencies in the licensing process. This disregards the legislative authority and the established regulatory framework. A further incorrect approach might be to solely focus on speed without considering the qualitative aspects of applicant suitability, such as psychological evaluations or community impact assessments, which are integral to responsible firearm licensing under Israeli law. Professional decision-making in such situations requires a systematic approach. First, understanding the precise legal requirements and objectives of the Firearms Law. Second, identifying specific points of inefficiency within the established legal framework. Third, proposing solutions that are compliant with the law and demonstrably enhance efficiency without compromising safety. And finally, seeking appropriate legal and ministerial approval for any proposed changes. Question 9. The audit findings indicate that a firearm license applicant in Israel has claimed a public need for a firearm due to their profession as a security consultant working in high-risk areas. What is the most appropriate regulatory compliance approach for the licensing authority to take? Option A. Conduct a thorough investigation to verify the applicant's claims of public need by requesting specific documentation of their work in high-risk areas and assessing the objective risks involved, cross-referencing with any available intelligence or professional body confirmations. Option B. Accept the applicant's self-declaration of public need based on their professional role, assuming that their chosen profession inherently justifies the need for a firearm. Option C. Grant the license based on the applicant's professional status and a clean criminal record, without further scrutiny of the specific public need claim. Option D. Deny the license application immediately, citing that personal safety concerns, even in a professional context, do not constitute a sufficient public need under Israeli firearm licensing law. The correct answer is A. Conduct a thorough investigation to verify the applicant's claims of public need by requesting specific documentation of their work in high-risk areas and assessing the objective risks involved, cross-referencing with any available intelligence or professional body confirmations. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the applicant's stated intent with the stringent requirements of Israeli firearm licensing regulations, specifically concerning the public need criterion. Misinterpreting or inadequately assessing this criterion can lead to either the denial of a legitimate license or the issuance of a license to someone who does not meet the legal threshold, potentially compromising public safety. The licensing authority must exercise careful judgment to ensure compliance with the Firearms Law, 5707-1947, and its associated regulations. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough, documented assessment of the applicant's stated public need for a firearm, cross-referencing it with established criteria and evidence. This approach requires the licensing officer to actively seek and verify information that substantiates the claimed need, such as specific threats, documented professional requirements, or demonstrable risks that a firearm would mitigate. The justification for this approach lies in the explicit requirements of Israeli law, which mandates that a license is granted only when a genuine public need is demonstrated. This ensures that firearms are issued responsibly and not based on mere personal preference or unsubstantiated claims, thereby upholding the spirit and letter of the firearms law. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves accepting the applicant's self-declaration of public need without any independent verification or further inquiry. This fails to meet the legal obligation to assess and confirm the existence of a genuine public need, potentially leading to the issuance of a license without proper justification and contravening the principles of responsible firearm regulation. Another incorrect approach is to deny the license solely based on the applicant's perceived lack of a compelling personal reason, without fully exploring or documenting the potential public need aspects. This may overlook legitimate justifications that fall under the broader interpretation of public need as defined by the regulations, leading to an arbitrary denial. A further incorrect approach is to grant the license based on the applicant's perceived good character and lack of criminal record, while neglecting the specific requirement to demonstrate public need. While good character is a prerequisite, it does not in itself satisfy the distinct legal criterion of public need, making this approach legally insufficient. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this role must adopt a systematic and evidence-based approach. This involves understanding the specific legal definitions and requirements of public need within the Israeli context. When an applicant claims public need, the professional must initiate a process of inquiry and evidence gathering. This includes requesting supporting documentation, conducting interviews, and cross-referencing information with relevant authorities or databases where appropriate. The decision-making process should be guided by the principle of innocent until proven guilty, but balanced with the paramount responsibility of public safety and adherence to the law. Any decision, whether approval or denial, must be clearly documented, with the reasoning explicitly linked to the legal criteria and the evidence gathered. Question 10. The risk matrix shows a potential for miscalculation of firearm licensing fees in Israel. If an applicant is seeking a license for a 9mm semi-automatic pistol classified under category of the Israeli Firearms Law, 5731-1971, and is a civilian resident of Tel Aviv, what would be the correct licensing fee if the base fee for category of firearms is $500, and there is a 10% surcharge for non-residents and a 20% discount for licensed security personnel with no other applicable adjustments? Option A, $550. Option B, 500. Option C, 450. Option D, 400. Correct answer is B, 500. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge involving the interpretation and application of Israeli firearm licensing regulations, specifically concerning the calculation of fees based on the type of firearm and the applicant's status. Misinterpreting these regulations can lead to incorrect fee assessments, potentially resulting in financial penalties for the applicant or the licensing authority, and could even impact the validity of the license itself if fees are significantly understated. The core challenge lies in accurately applying the tiered fee structure and understanding the specific definitions within the Israeli firearms law and its associated regulations. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves a precise calculation of the licensing fee by first identifying the firearms classification according to the Israeli Firearms Law 5731-1971 and its subsequent regulations. This classification determines the base fee. Then the applicant's specific status, e.g., civilian security personnel collector, must be cross-referenced with the fee schedule to apply any applicable discounts or surcharges. For instance, if the firearm is classified as a pistol Category A and the applicant is a civilian, the fee would be the standard rate for Category A. If the applicant were a licensed security guard, a reduced rate might apply. The calculation would be base fee determined by firearm category, *1 discount percentage, if applicable, plus surcharge if applicable. This method ensures adherence to the precise wording of the law and regulations, preventing underpayment or overpayment. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to apply a flat fee regardless of the firearm type or applicant status. This fails to comply with the tiered fee structure mandated by the Israeli firearms law, which explicitly differentiates fees based on firearm classification and applicant eligibility. Another incorrect approach is to only consider the firearm's caliber without referencing its official classification under the law. The law's categorization is based on more than just caliber, encompassing factors like mechanism and intended use, and ignoring this broader classification leads to an inaccurate fee. Finally, an approach that relies on anecdotal information or past practices without consulting the current official fee schedule and legal definitions is also flawed. This can result in outdated fee calculations and non-compliance with the most recent regulatory updates. Professional reasoning. Professionals dealing with firearm licensing in Israel must adopt a systematic approach. This begins with thoroughly understanding the Israeli Firearms Law 5731-1971 and all relevant regulations, particularly those detailing firearm classifications and fee structures. When faced with a specific application, the first step is to accurately classify the firearm according to the law. Subsequently, the applicant's status must be verified against the provisions that dictate fee adjustments. All calculations should be documented, referencing the specific legal provisions used. In cases of ambiguity, seeking clarification from the relevant licensing authority is paramount to ensure compliance and prevent errors. Question 11. The control framework reveals an applicant for a firearm license in Israel has a documented history of 2 minor altercations that occurred 5 and 7 years ago, respectively. Both incidents were resolved without criminal charges. What is the most appropriate course of action for the licensing authority? Option A. Automatically deny the firearm license application due to the presence of past altercations, regardless of their severity or recency. Option B. Grant the firearm license without further investigation, assuming that minor altercations from several years ago do not pose a significant risk. Option C. Conduct a thorough review of the nature and context of the altercations, considering the time elapsed and any evidence of rehabilitation, to determine the applicant's current suitability for firearm ownership. Option D. Issue a provisional license contingent on the applicant attending anger management classes, without a full assessment of the past incidents. The correct answer is C. Conduct a thorough review of the nature and context of the altercations, considering the time elapsed and any evidence of rehabilitation, to determine the applicant's current suitability for firearm ownership. Explanation. The control framework reveals a scenario where an applicant for a firearm license in Israel has a history of minor altercations. This presents a professional challenge because the Israeli firearms law, Hebrew Het, Hebrew Vav, Hebrew Kuf, Hebrew Kaf, Hebrew Lamed, Hebrew Yod, Hebrew Yod, Hebrew Resh, Hebruyot Hebruhe, Hebrutav Hebrushin, Hebrutet 1949, and its associated regulations require a thorough assessment of an applicant's suitability, which extends beyond mere technical eligibility to encompass character and potential risk. The licensing authority must balance the right to self-defense with public safety, necessitating careful judgment in evaluating past behavior. The correct approach involves a comprehensive review of the applicant's history, specifically focusing on the nature and recency of the altercations, and assessing whether they indicate a propensity for violence or an inability to exercise responsible firearm ownership. This approach aligns with the spirit and letter of the Israeli firearms law, which mandates that licenses be granted only to individuals deemed fit and not posing a risk to themselves or others. The authority must consider the totality of circumstances, including any evidence of rehabilitation or mitigating factors, to make an informed decision. This is the best professional practice as it adheres to the regulatory requirement for a holistic assessment of an applicant's suitability. An incorrect approach would be to automatically deny the license solely based on the existence of past altercations, without a nuanced evaluation of their severity, context, and the applicant's subsequent conduct. This fails to acknowledge that minor, isolated incidents in the distant past may not necessarily render an individual unfit for firearm ownership, and it bypasses the required discretionary judgment of the licensing authority. Another incorrect approach would be to grant the license without any further inquiry, assuming that since the altercations were minor, they pose no significant risk. This neglects the regulatory obligation to actively assess suitability and potential risks, thereby potentially compromising public safety. A third incorrect approach would be to rely solely on police records without seeking additional information or context from the applicant, which could lead to an incomplete or biased assessment. Professionals in this field should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes thoroughness, fairness, and adherence to the specific legal requirements of the Israeli firearms law. This involves gathering all relevant information, objectively evaluating the applicant's history against the criteria for suitability, considering any mitigating or aggravating factors, and documenting the decision-making process meticulously. The focus should always be on making a determination that upholds both individual rights and public safety, in strict accordance with the law. Question 12. Strategic planning requires a licensing officer in Israel to assess an applicant for a firearm license, Yeryia, who has disclosed a history of anxiety, supported by a recent report from a mental health professional stating the applicant has managed the condition effectively and poses no current risk. How should the licensing officer proceed to ensure compliance with Israeli firearm licensing regulations? Option A. Request an extensive series of psychological evaluations and background checks beyond the scope of standard licensing procedures, effectively delaying the decision indefinitely until all possible concerns are exhaustively investigated. Option B. Deny the license application immediately due to the applicant's history of anxiety, as any mental health concern is inherently a risk factor for firearm ownership. Option C. Evaluate the applicant's eligibility based on whether they meet all positive requirements for a license, and if the disclosed information constitutes an explicit legal disqualification according to the firearms law, 5707-1947, and its associated regulations. Option D. Inform the applicant that their application cannot be processed due to the disclosure of a mental health condition, without further specific justification or reference to legal disqualifying criteria. The correct answer is C. Evaluate the applicant's eligibility based on whether they meet all positive requirements for a license, and if the disclosed information constitutes an explicit legal disqualification according to the firearms law, 5707-1947, and its associated regulations. Explanation. Strategic planning requires a thorough understanding of the regulatory landscape governing firearm licensing in Israel. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it involves navigating the specific requirements and discretionary powers of the Israeli police, Mishteret Yisrael, when assessing an applicant's eligibility for a firearm license, Rishayon, particularly when dealing with information that might be perceived as sensitive but not explicitly disqualifying under the law. The core of the challenge lies in balancing the applicant's right to apply with the public safety mandate of the licensing authority. The correct approach involves a meticulous review of all submitted documentation against the explicit criteria outlined in Israeli firearm licensing regulations, such as the Firearms Law 5707-1947 and associated regulations and police directives. This includes verifying the applicant's identity, residency, age, mental and physical fitness, and absence of any disqualifying criminal record or history of violence. Crucially, it requires the licensing officer to assess any additional information provided, such as a report from a mental health professional, not in isolation, but in the context of the applicant's overall profile and the specific legal grounds for disqualification. If the information does not meet the threshold for disqualification as defined by law, the application should proceed based on the applicant's fulfillment of the positive requirements for licensing. This approach upholds due process and ensures decisions are based on established legal criteria, not subjective interpretations or assumptions. An incorrect approach would be to deny the license solely based on the applicant's disclosure of a past personal struggle with anxiety, even if supported by a mental health professional's report that does not conclude the applicant poses a risk. This is a regulatory failure because Israeli law requires a specific determination of unfitness or risk, not a generalized inference from a past condition that has been managed. Another incorrect approach is to delay the application indefinitely without a clear legal basis, or to request extraneous information not relevant to the licensing criteria, which can be seen as an arbitrary obstruction of the application process. Furthermore, denying the application without providing the applicant with a clear explanation of the specific legal grounds for refusal, as mandated by administrative law principles, is also a failure. Professional decision-making in such situations requires a systematic process. First, thoroughly understand the applicant's submission and the relevant legal framework. Second, objectively assess whether the applicant meets all positive requirements for a license. Third, if any information raises concerns, evaluate it strictly against the defined grounds for disqualification in the firearms law and related regulations. Fourth, if the information does not constitute a legal disqualification, proceed with the application. If it does, ensure the applicant is informed of the specific legal reasons for denial and their right to appeal. Question 13. Cost-benefit analysis shows that a rigorous review of an applicant's mental health history is crucial for responsible firearm licensing in Israel. An applicant for a firearm license in Israel has disclosed a past diagnosis of mild anxiety treated with medication several years ago, for which they are no longer taking medication and report no current symptoms. What is the most appropriate regulatory compliance approach for the licensing authority to determine the applicant's fitness to hold a firearm license? Option A. Request a letter from the applicant's friends and family attesting to their stable mental state, and use this as the primary basis for determining their fitness. Option B. Obtain explicit consent to access all relevant medical records pertaining to the past diagnosis and treatment, and have these reviewed by a qualified medical professional to assess current fitness against the specific criteria outlined in Israeli firearm licensing regulations. Option C. Dismiss the past diagnosis as irrelevant due to the applicant's current self-reported lack of symptoms and cessation of medication, and grant the license based on this information alone. Option D. Accept the applicant's self-declaration that they are no longer experiencing symptoms and have discontinued medication, and proceed with the license application without further medical inquiry. Correct answer is B. Obtain explicit consent to access all relevant medical records pertaining to the past diagnosis and treatment, and have these reviewed by a qualified medical professional to assess current fitness against the specific criteria outlined in Israeli firearm licensing regulations. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an applicant to navigate the complexities of Israeli firearm licensing regulations while ensuring full compliance with the stated requirements. The challenge lies in accurately interpreting and applying the specific criteria for medical fitness, particularly concerning mental health, which is a sensitive area with strict legal and ethical consideration. Misinterpreting these requirements can lead to denial of a license, or worse, the issuance of a license to an individual who may pose a risk, thereby compromising public safety and the integrity of the licensing process. Careful judgment is required to balance the applicant's rights with the paramount need for public safety, as mandated by Israeli law. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough and documented review of the applicant's medical history, specifically focusing on any documented history of mental health conditions that could impair judgment or pose a risk. This approach requires obtaining all relevant medical records, including those pertaining to psychiatric evaluations, diagnoses, and treatment, and critically assessing them against the criteria outlined in Israeli firearm licensing regulations. The applicant must provide explicit consent for the release of these records. The licensing authority, in this case, the Israeli National Police, Israel Police, has the legal mandate to request and review such information to determine fitness. The correct approach prioritizes a comprehensive, evidence-based assessment that directly addresses the regulatory requirements for mental fitness, ensuring that any decision is grounded in objective medical information and legal stipulations. This aligns with the principle of responsible firearm ownership and public safety as enshrined in Israeli law. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to rely solely on the applicant's self-declaration of good mental health without seeking any corroborating medical documentation. This fails to meet the regulatory requirement for a thorough assessment of mental fitness and bypasses the due diligence expected of the licensing authority. It creates a significant risk of overlooking underlying conditions that could affect an individual's ability to safely possess a firearm. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss any mention of past mental health treatment as irrelevant without a proper evaluation. Israeli regulations require a careful consideration of all relevant medical history. Ignoring or downplaying past treatment, even if the applicant claims to be recovered, is a failure to conduct a comprehensive assessment and could lead to a flawed decision. The licensing authority must assess the nature of the condition, the treatment received, and the current state of the applicant's mental health as determined by qualified professionals. A further incorrect approach is to base the decision on anecdotal evidence or personal opinions about the applicant's character, rather than on objective medical and legal criteria. Firearm licensing is a regulated process governed by specific laws and regulations, not by subjective judgments. Relying on hearsay or personal impressions, without verifiable medical or legal grounds, undermines the integrity of the licensing process and is a direct contravention of the regulatory framework. Professional reasoning. Professionals involved in firearm licensing must adopt a systematic and evidence-based decision-making process. This begins with a clear understanding of the specific legal requirements of the Israeli firearm licensing laws, particularly concerning medical and psychological fitness. When an applicant has a history of mental health conditions, the process must involve obtaining explicit consent to access all relevant medical records. These records should then be reviewed by qualified personnel, potentially including medical professionals, to assess the applicant's current fitness against the legal standards. Any decision must be documented thoroughly, with clear justification based on the evidence reviewed and the applicable regulations. This structured approach ensures fairness to the applicant, while upholding the primary responsibility of safeguarding public safety. Question 14. Operational review demonstrates that an applicant for a firearm license in Israel has submitted an application detailing a perceived need based on general concerns about neighborhood safety and a desire for personal protection. The applicant appears sincere and has provided a written statement outlining these concerns. What is the most appropriate regulatory compliance approach for the licensing authority? Option A. Deny the firearm license immediately due to the general nature of the stated need, as it does not specify a unique or immediate threat. Option B. Conduct a thorough investigation to verify the applicant's stated need, seeking objective evidence and cross-referencing with official crime statistics and any relevant incident reports, while ensuring all other licensing requirements are met. Option C. Request additional documentation related to the applicant's financial stability and social standing to assess their overall responsibility and suitability for firearm ownership. Option D. Issue the firearm license based on the applicant's sincere testimony and written statement, assuming their concerns are valid and sufficient for personal protection. Correct answer is B. Conduct a thorough investigation to verify the applicant's stated need, seeking objective evidence and cross-referencing with official crime statistics and any relevant incident reports, while ensuring all other licensing requirements are met. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the applicant's stated intent with the stringent requirements of Israeli firearm licensing regulation, specifically concerning the need for a firearm. Misinterpreting or inadequately assessing the applicant's justification can lead to either the issuance of a license to someone who doesn't meet the legal threshold, or the denial of a license to a deserving individual, both of which have significant legal and public safety implications under Israeli law. The onus is on the licensing authority to conduct a thorough and objective assessment. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves a comprehensive review of the applicant's stated need, cross-referencing it with objective evidence and the specific criteria outlined in Israeli firearm licensing regulations. This includes verifying the credibility of the threat or reason provided, assessing the applicant's suitability, and ensuring all documentation is complete and accurate according to the Ministry of National Security's directives. This approach is correct because it adheres strictly to the legal framework, which mandates a demonstrable and justifiable need for a firearm, rather than relying on subjective impressions or unsubstantiated claims. It prioritizes public safety and the rule of law by ensuring licenses are issued only when legally warranted. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to grant the license based solely on the applicant's personal testimony and perceived sincerity, without seeking independent verification or objective evidence of the stated need. This fails to meet the regulatory requirement for a demonstrable and justifiable reason, potentially compromising public safety by issuing a license without sufficient scrutiny. Another incorrect approach is to deny the license immediately upon encountering any minor discrepancy or ambiguity in the application, without providing the applicant an opportunity to clarify or supplement their submission. This can be seen as an overly rigid interpretation of the regulations and may unfairly penalize applicants who are otherwise qualified and have a legitimate need. It bypasses the due diligence required to ensure a fair and accurate assessment. A further incorrect approach is to focus primarily on the applicant's financial status or social standing as a proxy for their need or responsibility, rather than on the specific criteria for firearm possession. Israeli firearm licensing is not based on wealth or status, but on a demonstrable need and the applicant's suitability, making this approach irrelevant and a violation of the regulatory intent. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this role must adopt a systematic and evidence-based decision-making process. This involves 1. Thoroughly understanding the specific legal requirements for firearm licensing in Israel, including the definition of need. 2. Objectively evaluating all submitted documentation and applicant statements against these legal criteria. 3. Actively seeking corroborating evidence where necessary to validate claims. 4. Providing clear communication to applicants regarding requirements and decisions. 5. Maintaining impartiality and avoiding subjective biases. The goal is to ensure compliance with the law while upholding public safety and fairness. Question 15. The monitoring system demonstrates that an applicant for a firearm license in Israel has submitted an application with several sections appearing incomplete, specifically regarding proof of residence and a medical certificate. What is the most appropriate regulatory compliance action to take? Option A. Issue the firearm license immediately, assuming the applicant will submit the missing documents at a later stage to avoid delaying the process. Option B. Reject the firearm license application outright due to the initial incompleteness of the submitted forms. Option C. Forward the incomplete application to the police for an immediate background check without addressing the missing documentation. Option D. Request the applicant to provide the missing documentation and any additional information deemed necessary by the licensing authority to complete the assessment, in accordance with the Firearms Law 5701-1941. The correct answer is D. Request the applicant to provide the missing documentation and any additional information deemed necessary by the licensing authority to complete the assessment, in accordance with the Firearms Law 5701-1941. Explanation. The monitoring system demonstrates a potential lapse in regulatory compliance concerning firearm licensing in Israel. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires immediate and accurate identification of the regulatory breach and the appropriate corrective action, balancing public safety with individual rights. A failure to act decisively could have severe legal and ethical consequences. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the applicant's documentation against the requirements stipulated by Israeli firearm licensing laws, specifically the Firearms Law 5701-1941 and its associated regulations. This includes verifying the applicant's eligibility criteria, such as age, mental and physical fitness, criminal record, and the stated purpose for possessing a firearm. If the documentation is incomplete or raises concerns, the licensing authority must request the missing information or conduct further investigations as mandated by law before issuing or renewing a license. This ensures that all licensing decisions are based on a comprehensive and legally sound assessment, upholding the stringent standards for firearm ownership in Israel and prioritizing public safety. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with issuing the license without addressing the discrepancies. This directly violates the principle of due diligence required by the Firearms Law, which mandates a comprehensive assessment of every applicant. Failing to verify the completeness and accuracy of the submitted documents could lead to the issuance of a license to an unqualified individual, posing a significant risk to public safety and contravening the spirit and letter of Israeli firearm control legislation. Another incorrect approach would be to summarily reject the application solely based on the initial observation of missing information, without providing the applicant an opportunity to rectify the situation. Unless the missing information is a fundamental disqualifier, Israeli administrative law generally requires procedural fairness, which includes giving individuals a chance to be heard or to correct minor deficiencies in their applications, provided the law does not explicitly prohibit such a course of action for the specific missing item. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to ignore the discrepancy and approve the license, assuming the applicant will provide the information later. This demonstrates a severe lack of professional responsibility and regulatory adherence. The licensing process is designed to be proactive, not reactive, and relies on complete information at the point of decision-making to prevent potential harm. Professionals in this field must adopt a systematic decision-making process. First, identify the specific regulatory requirement that appears to be unmet. Second, consult the relevant sections of the Firearms Law 5701-1941 and its regulations to understand the precise obligations and permissible actions. Third, determine if the observed discrepancy constitutes a minor procedural issue that can be rectified or a fundamental eligibility flaw. Fourth, communicate clearly and formally with the applicant regarding the deficiency and the required steps for resolution, or, if necessary, the grounds for rejection, always adhering to the principles of administrative fairness and legal mandate. Question 16. The audit findings indicate that an applicant for a firearm license in Israel has a history of seeking professional mental health treatment several years ago, which was successfully managed. The applicant is concerned that this information might negatively impact their application. What is the most appropriate course of action for the applicant to ensure compliance with Israeli firearm licensing regulations? Option A. Omit any mention of the past mental health treatment from the application, assuming it is no longer relevant and will not be discovered. Option B. Only disclose the past mental health treatment if specifically questioned about it during a follow-up interview. Option C. Proactively and truthfully disclose the past mental health treatment to the Ministry of Justice's Firearms Department as part of the application process. Option D. Provide a general statement about seeking personal counseling, without detailing the specific mental health treatment received. The correct answer is C. Proactively and truthfully disclose the past mental health treatment to the Ministry of Justice's Firearms Department as part of the application process. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an applicant to navigate the specific requirements of Israeli firearm licensing regulations, particularly concerning the declaration of past mental health treatment. Failure to accurately disclose such information can lead to immediate license denial and potential future repercussions, including criminal charges if deemed intentional misrepresentation. The applicant's desire to obtain a license must be balanced against the strict legal obligation to provide truthful and complete information to the licensing authority. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves the applicant proactively and truthfully disclosing their past mental health treatment to the Ministry of Justice's Firearms Department. This approach is correct because Israeli firearm licensing law, specifically the Firearms Law 5707-1947, and its associated regulations, mandates full disclosure of any information relevant to an applicant's suitability to possess a firearm. The licensing authority is empowered to assess the applicant's current mental state and the nature of past treatment to determine if they pose a risk. By being upfront, the applicant allows the authorities to conduct a proper assessment based on complete information, which is the cornerstone of regulatory compliance and public safety. This demonstrates honesty and respect for the legal process. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is for the applicant to omit any mention of their past mental health treatment, believing it is irrelevant or will not be discovered. This is a significant regulatory failure, as it constitutes a direct violation of the disclosure requirements under the Firearms Law. The Ministry of Justice has mechanisms to verify information, and discovered omissions can be treated as deliberate deception, leading to license denial and potential legal consequences. Another incorrect approach is for the applicant to only disclose the mental health treatment if directly asked about it during an interview, without proactively including it in their initial application. While this might seem like a partial compliance, it still falls short of the spirit and letter of the law, which expects a comprehensive declaration of relevant factors from the outset. This could be interpreted as an attempt to conceal information until it is unavoidable, undermining the applicant's credibility and potentially leading to a negative assessment. A further incorrect approach is for the applicant to provide vague or misleading information about the treatment, such as downplaying its severity or duration. This is also a regulatory failure because it fails to provide the licensing authority with the necessary details to conduct a thorough and informed assessment. The law requires truthful and complete disclosure, not selective or deceptive reporting, to ensure the safety of the public. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing similar situations should adopt a framework of proactive transparency and full disclosure. This involves thoroughly understanding the specific disclosure obligations mandated by the relevant Israeli legislation. When in doubt about what information is relevant, it is always safer to err on the side of providing more information rather than less. Seeking advice from legal counsel specializing in Israeli firearms law can also be beneficial in understanding complex disclosure requirements and ensuring compliance. The ultimate goal is to build trust with the regulatory authority through honesty and adherence to the law. Question 17. Implementation of the firearm license renewal process in Israel requires applicants to undergo specific medical and psychological evaluations. If an applicant for a Rishayon Yeryia renewal in Tel Aviv claims to have recently completed a similar assessment for a different purpose and requests to submit that instead of the mandated Israeli evaluation, what is the most appropriate regulatory compliance approach for the licensing authority? Option A. Issue a provisional license extension for a limited period, allowing the applicant to obtain the required Israeli evaluation within a specified time frame. Option B. Deny the renewal application immediately due to the applicant's failure to present the correct documentation as per the initial renewal request. Option C. Insist on a new medical and psychological evaluation conducted by an authorized Israeli physician and psychologist, as stipulated by the Ministry of National Security Regulations for firearm license renewals. Option D. Accept the applicant's previously completed evaluation, provided they submit documentation of its recency and general nature to expedite the renewal process. The correct answer is C. Insist on a new medical and psychological evaluation conducted by an authorized Israeli physician and psychologist, as stipulated by the Ministry of National Security Regulations for firearm license renewals. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires navigating the specific requirements for firearm license renewal in Israel, particularly concerning the mandatory medical and psychological evaluations. Failure to adhere strictly to these regulations can lead to the denial of a license, potential legal repercussions, and a breach of public safety protocols. The applicant's attempt to circumvent a required evaluation presents an ethical dilemma for the licensing authority, demanding a firm but fair application of the law. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves strictly adhering to the procedures outlined in Israeli firearm licensing regulations, which mandate that all applicants for license renewal undergo a medical and psychological evaluation by an authorized physician and psychologist, respectively, as determined by the Ministry of National Security. This approach is correct because it directly implements the legal framework designed to ensure that firearm owners continue to meet the stringent safety and suitability standards required by Israeli law. The law prioritizes public safety, and these evaluations are a critical mechanism for assessing an individual's ongoing fitness to possess a firearm. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves accepting the applicant's claim of having recently undergone a similar evaluation in a different context without verifying its compliance with the specific requirements for Israeli firearm licenses. This is incorrect because it bypasses the mandated evaluation process, potentially overlooking critical factors relevant to firearm safety that may not have been assessed in the previous evaluation. It undermines the regulatory framework's intent to ensure suitability for firearm ownership within the Israeli context. Another incorrect approach is to grant a temporary license extension based solely on the applicant's assurance that they will complete the evaluation soon. This is incorrect because it deviates from the established renewal procedure and introduces an element of risk by allowing firearm possession without the required current assessment of fitness. Israeli law does not typically provide for such discretionary temporary extensions without a clear legal basis and safeguards. A further incorrect approach is to dismiss the renewal application outright due to the applicant's initial reluctance to undergo the evaluation, without first clearly explaining the mandatory nature of the process and offering a reasonable opportunity to comply. While the evaluation is mandatory, a professional approach involves clear communication and adherence to due process, ensuring the applicant understands the requirements before a final decision is made. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this field must adopt a systematic approach. First, thoroughly understand the specific legal requirements for firearm license renewal in Israel, including all mandatory documentation and evaluations. Second, communicate these requirements clearly and unequivocally to the applicant. Third, assess all submitted documentation against the legal standards. Fourth, if an applicant attempts to bypass a mandatory step, the professional must explain the legal obligation and the consequences of noncompliance, offering a defined period for the applicant to fulfill the requirements. Decisions must be based solely on the established legal framework and public safety considerations, avoiding personal discretion that could compromise regulatory integrity. Question 18. To address the challenge of ensuring public safety while processing firearm license applications in Israel, which of the following risk assessment approaches best aligns with the principles of responsible firearm regulation? Option A. Deny the license application immediately if there is any perceived, unsubstantiated concern about the potential for future misuse, regardless of the applicant's stated purpose or background. Option B. Accept the applicant's stated purpose at face value and proceed with the licensing process without further investigation, assuming the applicant is of sound mind and intent. Option C. Conduct a thorough review of the applicant's stated purpose for firearm ownership, meticulously cross-referencing it with any available background information that might indicate a heightened risk of misuse or danger, and document all findings. Option D. Issue the firearm license promptly upon confirmation of the applicant's basic eligibility criteria, without delving into the nuances of their stated purpose or potential risk factors. The correct answer is C. Conduct a thorough review of the applicant's stated purpose for firearm ownership, meticulously cross-referencing it with any available background information that might indicate a heightened risk of misuse or danger, and document all findings. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the applicant's stated intent for firearm ownership with the inherent risks associated with such ownership, as mandated by Israeli firearm licensing regulations. The licensing authority must conduct a thorough risk assessment to determine if the applicant poses a potential danger to themselves or others, a core tenet of responsible firearm regulation in Israel. This involves scrutinizing not just the stated purpose, but also any underlying factors that might indicate a heightened risk. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a comprehensive evaluation of the applicant's stated purpose for acquiring a firearm, cross-reference with any available information that might suggest a heightened risk of misuse or danger. This includes a detailed review of the applicant's background, mental health history, where legally permissible and relevant, and any past incidents that could be indicative of instability or aggressive tendencies. The Israeli firearm licensing process, governed by the Firearms Law, 5707-1947, and its associated regulations, emphasizes a proactive risk assessment to ensure public safety. Therefore, thoroughly investigating the applicant's background and stated purpose, and considering any potential red flags, is the most responsible and legally compliant approach. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to solely rely on the applicant's stated purpose without any further investigation. This fails to meet the regulatory requirement for a robust risk assessment, as it ignores potential underlying issues that could make the applicant unsuitable for firearm ownership. It is a passive approach that prioritizes convenience over safety, potentially violating the spirit and letter of the firearms law. Another incorrect approach is to deny the license solely based on a vague concern about the potential for misuse without concrete evidence or a clear regulatory basis. While caution is necessary, arbitrary denial without a thorough, documented assessment of risk is unprofessional and could be challenged. The decision must be grounded in specific findings related to the applicant's suitability, as determined by the established risk assessment criteria. A third incorrect approach is to grant the license without adequately considering the applicant's stated purpose and its implications. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to adhere to the risk assessment protocol designed to prevent firearms from falling into the wrong hands. It prioritizes expediency over the critical mandate of public safety. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this field must adopt a systematic and evidence-based approach to risk assessment. This involves understanding the specific legal framework, in this case, Israeli firearm laws, gathering all relevant information, objectively evaluating potential risks, and making decisions that are both legally defensible and ethically sound, prioritizing public safety above all else. Question 19. The review process indicates an applicant for a firearm license in Israel has a documented history of several domestic disputes with a former partner, though none resulted in criminal charges or convictions. The applicant asserts these were misunderstandings and that they have since resolved their issues. What is the most appropriate course of action for the licensing authority? Option A. Issue the firearm license without further investigation, accepting the applicant's assertion that the disputes were misunderstandings and have been resolved. Option B. Automatically deny the firearm license application due to the presence of documented domestic disputes, regardless of the absence of criminal convictions. Option C. Conduct a thorough, individualized risk assessment, gathering all available documentation related to the disputes, interviewing the applicant and seeking corroborating information to determine suitability based on Israeli firearms law and Ministry of National Security directives. Option D. Request a psychological evaluation of the applicant solely based on the mention of domestic disputes, without a broader assessment of their history or the nature of the incidents. The correct answer is C. Conduct a thorough, individualized risk assessment, gathering all available documentation related to the disputes, interviewing the applicant, and seeking corroborating information to determine suitability based on Israeli firearms law and Ministry of National Security directives. Explanation. The review process indicates a scenario where an applicant for a firearm license in Israel has a history of domestic disputes. This situation is professionally challenging because it requires a delicate balance between upholding public safety and respecting an individual's rights, all within the strict confines of Israeli firearm licensing regulations, specifically the Firearms Law, 5707-1947, and its associated regulations, and the Ministry of National Security's directives. The core challenge lies in assessing whether past domestic disputes, even if not resulting in criminal convictions, pose a sufficient risk to warrant license denial, considering the potential for misuse of a firearm in volatile personal situations. Careful judgment is required to interpret the nuances of the applicant's history and its relevance to firearm possession. The best professional approach involves a thorough, individualized risk assessment that meticulously examines the nature, severity, recency, and pattern of the domestic disputes. This includes seeking corroborating evidence, such as police reports, witness statements, or any restraining orders, even if they were not ultimately enforced or led to charges. The assessment must directly consider the criteria outlined in the firearms law and ministry directives regarding suitability and public safety. This approach is correct because it adheres to the principle of proportionality and due diligence mandated by Israeli law, which requires a comprehensive evaluation of an applicant's character and potential risk factors before issuing a license. It prioritizes public safety by not overlooking potential warning signs, while also avoiding arbitrary denial based solely on the existence of disputes without a proper risk evaluation. An incorrect approach would be to automatically deny the license solely because domestic disputes are documented, without conducting a deeper investigation into the specifics. This fails to comply with the legal requirement for a nuanced assessment and could be considered an arbitrary decision, potentially leading to legal challenges. Another incorrect approach would be to disregard the domestic disputes entirely, assuming that a lack of criminal conviction equates to no risk. This neglects the explicit mandate within firearm licensing regulations to consider all relevant information that might indicate a risk to public safety, including non-criminal incidents that demonstrate a propensity for violence or instability. Finally, relying solely on the applicant's self-reporting without independent verification or investigation would be professionally unsound and a failure to exercise due diligence, as it leaves the assessment vulnerable to incomplete or misleading information. Professionals in this field should employ a structured decision-making process that begins with a comprehensive review of all available documentation. This should be followed by an in-depth interview with the applicant, where specific questions are posed regarding the nature of the disputes. Crucially, this process must involve seeking external information where permissible and relevant, such as police records or reports from involved parties, to corroborate or clarify the applicant's account. The final decision must be grounded in a clear articulation of how the gathered information aligns with or deviates from the established criteria for firearm licensing in Israel, with a primary focus on the applicant's suitability and the potential risk to public safety. Question 20. Examination of the data shows an applicant for a firearm license in Israel has declared an annual gross income of $150,000. Their fixed monthly expenses, rent, utilities, insurance, total $5,000, and variable monthly expenses, food, transportation, personal care, are estimated to average $4,000 per month. The applicant also has outstanding loan repayments totaling $20,000 annually. If the Israeli police's risk assessment guidelines suggest that an applicant's net disposable income after all expenses and debt servicing must be at least $25,000 annually to be considered financially stable for firearm ownership, what is the applicant's net disposable income, and do they meet this minimum financial stability threshold? Option A. The applicant's net disposable income is $46,000 annually, and they meet the minimum financial stability threshold. Option B. The applicant's net disposable income is $30,000 annually, and they meet the minimum financial stability threshold. Option C. The applicant's net disposable income is $46,000 annually, but they do not meet the minimum financial stability threshold. Option D. The applicant's net disposable income is $80,000 annually, and they meet the minimum financial stability threshold. The correct answer is A. The applicant's net disposable income is $46,000 annually, and they meet the minimum financial stability threshold. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge in accurately assessing the financial risk associated with a firearm license application in Israel, specifically concerning the applicant's declared income and potential liabilities. The challenge lies in translating the applicant's financial data into a quantifiable risk metric that aligns with the requirements of the Israeli firearms law. Hebrew Het, Hebrew Vav, Hebrew Kuf, Hebrew Kaf, Hebrew Lamed, Hebrew Yod, Hebrew Yod, Hebrew Resh, Hebrew Yod, Hebrew Yod, Hebrew He, Hebrew He, Hebrew Tav, Hebrew Shin, Hebrew Yod 1949, and its associated regulations, which mandate a thorough assessment of an applicant's suitability, including their financial stability. The core of the difficulty is determining if the applicant's financial situation poses a risk that could compromise their responsible ownership and secure storage of a firearm. The best professional approach involves a detailed calculation of the applicant's net disposable income after accounting for all declared fixed and variable expenses, as well as existing financial obligations. This calculation should then be compared against a benchmark or threshold established by the Ministry of National Security. Hebrew he, Hebrew mem, Hebrew shin, Hebrew resh, Hebrew dalet, Hebrew lamed, Hebrew bet, Hebrew yod, Hebrew tet, Hebrew het, Hebrew vav, Hebrew nun, Hebrew pe, Hebrew nun, Hebrew yod, Hebrew mem, or the Israel Police. Hebrew mem, Hebrew shin, Hebrew tet, Hebrew resh, Hebrew tav, Hebrew yod, Hebrew shin, Hebrew resh, Hebrew aleph, Hebrew lamed. For firearm license applicants, which may be implicitly or explicitly defined in their operational guidelines or risk assessment matrices. This method directly addresses the regulatory requirement to ensure applicants are financially stable and capable of maintaining the firearm and its secure storage without undue financial strain, which could indirectly lead to negligence. The calculation would typically involve net disposable income equals total annual income, total annual fixed expenses, total annual variable expenses, annual debt servicing costs. For example, if an applicant declares an annual income of $120,000 fixed monthly expenses, rent, mortgage, insurance of $4,000, variable monthly expenses, food, utilities, transportation averaging $3,000, and annual debt payments, car loan, credit cards, totaling $15,000, the calculation would be total annual income equals $120,000, total annual fixed expenses equals $4,000/month asterisk 12 months equals $48,000, total annual variable expenses equals $3,000/month asterisk 12 months equals $36,000, annual debt servicing costs equals $15,000, net disposable income equals $120,000, $48,000/36,000/15,000 equals $21,000. This $21,000 represents the applicant's annual capacity to absorb unforeseen expenses or maintain the firearm's upkeep without compromising other essential financial obligations. The assessment then involves comparing this figure to any established risk thresholds. An incorrect approach would be to simply sum the applicant's declared income without considering expenses or liabilities. This fails to provide a realistic picture of their financial capacity and ignores the potential for financial distress to impact responsible firearm ownership, a key concern under Israeli firearms legislation. Another incorrect approach is to focus solely on the applicant's credit score without performing a detailed income and expense analysis. While a credit score can indicate past financial behavior, it does not directly assess current disposable income or the ability to manage ongoing financial responsibilities related to firearm ownership. A third incorrect approach is to estimate expenses based on broad averages for the region, without using the applicant's specific declared figures. This introduces significant inaccuracy and fails to meet the requirement for a personalized and thorough risk assessment mandated by the regulatory framework. The professional reasoning process should involve a systematic review of all provided financial documentation, applying the detailed calculation method described above, and comparing the result against established risk assessment criteria or guidelines provided by the relevant Israeli authorities. This ensures a data-driven and compliant decision-making process that prioritizes public safety and responsible firearm licensing.